Let me start with something the corporate media will never admit out loud, even though the evidence is now impossible to ignore. The world is shifting beneath our feet. The geopolitical ground that Washington assumed would remain frozen forever in the post-Cold War shape is cracking open. And one of the most fascinating, most revealing cracks in that old imperial pavement has just appeared in a place many Americans couldn't find on a map without GPS guidance: the Caribbean. Yes, the Caribbean, a region that U.S. foreign policy elites have treated for over a century as a kind of geopolitical Airbnb they assumed they owned by default. A region where American gunboats once parked the way Wall Street bankers park their cars: carelessly, confidently, and usually in places they didn't belong. And suddenly, something new is happening there, something that wasn't supposed to be possible. Venezuela. Yes, the same Venezuela that Washington has spent years describing as isolated, collapsed, on the brink, illegitimate, and every other adjective in the regime change dictionary, has just done the unthinkable. It has positioned modern Russian military systems within striking distance of U.S. territory. Now, you might say, well, Richard, isn't that provocative? Sure, it's provocative, but let's ask the more interesting question. Why is Venezuela able to do something that, according to Washington's narrative, it should have been far too weak, too isolated, too broken to attempt? Because what's happening has nothing to do with Venezuelan bravado and everything to do with the changing geometry of global power. The unipolar era is over. It didn't fade politely. It didn't dissolve with a thank you note. It cracked, split, and collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. But before we analyze those contradictions, let's rewind a bit. Because to understand why Venezuela's actions are more than a headline, to understand why they reveal the deeper economic story of our time, we need to revisit the 1990s. After the Soviet Union collapsed, U.S. elites believed history had ended. They even wrote books with titles like The End of History, which, in hindsight, aged about as well as a jug of milk left on a Miami sidewalk in July. The assumption was simple: the United States would dominate forever, militarily, politically, economically, culturally, even morally. The whole world was expected to adopt American capitalism like a mandatory software update. But history doesn't end. It transforms, it mutates, and more importantly, people push back. During those years, Washington behaved not like a caretaker of global stability, but like a landlord who had inherited the building and thought the tenants should be grateful just to live there. The U.S. invaded and bombed at will: Iraq, Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Libya. Coups and interventions across Latin America, Africa, Eastern Europe. The message was clear: we make the rules, you follow them. If you don't, we'll send someone to remind you. But here's where it gets interesting. Empires don't collapse because someone pushes them over. Empires collapse because they overreach. And the U.S. overreached spectacularly. Let's take Venezuela as a case study, because this is where many Americans misunderstand the story. When Washington placed crushing sanctions on Venezuela, it predicted that the government would fall within months. Maximum pressure, they called it. a polite euphemism for economic strangulation. Billions in assets frozen, oil exports blocked, medicine, technology, equipment, all obstructed. But instead of collapsing, Venezuela adapted. It turned to other partners: Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, countries Washington assumed would never dare to cooperate openly in the Western Hemisphere. And now here we are. Those same partners are providing Caracas with the kind of military and economic backing that makes Washington's old Monroe Doctrine look like a faded historical postcard. This is the part that the U.S. foreign policy establishment cannot wrap its head around. The countries it once lectured, sanctioned, and controlled are forming their own networks of cooperation, networks that bypass Washington entirely. China builds the infrastructure. Russia provides military support. Iran offers fuel, engineering, and industrial expertise. And Venezuela, far from being isolated, becomes a symbol of the new geopolitical math. When one empire tries to isolate you, but the rest of the world no longer fears that empire, isolation becomes impossible. Let's zoom out, because Venezuela is just one node in a much larger pattern. We see it in Saudi Arabia, which now cuts oil deals in yuan, in India, which refuses to participate in U.S. sanctions, in Africa, where U.S. and French military bases are being kicked out like rude guests at a party, in Southeast Asia, where nations openly say, we refuse to choose between Washington and Beijing. This is multipolarity, born not from ideology, but from economic necessity. And in political economy, necessity is always more powerful than rhetoric. Meanwhile, in the United States, workers struggle under stagnant wages, soaring rents, collapsing infrastructure, and the highest healthcare costs in the developed world. Yet Washington insists it must spend hundreds of billions policing the planet. Ask yourself, who benefits from this? Certainly not the American worker, certainly not the small business owner, certainly not the overstretched middle class. No, the beneficiaries are the same elites who profit from every stage of imperial expansion. Defense contractors, oil conglomerates, financial institutions, the revolving door consultants who go from government office to corporate boardroom and back again. They tell us the empire is necessary. They tell us the interventions are humanitarian. They tell us the sanctions are moral. And while they tell us these things, working people, both in the U.S. and abroad, pay the price. Let me give you an example. When the U.S. sanctions Venezuela, who suffers? Not the powerful, not the elites, but the workers, the children, the elderly, the ordinary people caught in the gears of geopolitical rivalry. And yet Washington calls this promoting democracy. Imagine if another country cut off U.S. access to medicine, technology, banking, and fuel because it disapproved of an American president. Would that be promoting democracy? No. It would be viewed, correctly, as economic warfare. Now let's return to the Caribbean, where U.S. warships patrol as if reenacting scenes from a Cold War film. For decades, the U.S. Navy operated there uncontested. No rival fleets, no competing military alliances, just an oceanic reminder of who was in charge. But suddenly, Venezuelan missile systems, supported by Russian technology, introduce something Washington hates more than anything else: consequences. When a superpower can act without consequences, diplomacy dies. When consequences reappear, diplomacy is reborn. Think about the ironic symmetry. For years, U.S. policymakers insisted that military dominance created peace. But in practice, military dominance created interventions, not peace. Now that the balance of power is shifting, Washington may rediscover the art of negotiation, an art it forgot sometime between the First and Second Iraq Wars. Let me add something corporate media will not say. To many people in the global South, Venezuela's defiance is not seen as aggression. It is seen as vindication, a long-awaited moment when a smaller country pushes back against a system that has treated it as disposable. Americans are taught that U.S. power is benign, benevolent, a force for good. But billions around the world have lived the other side of that story. CIA-backed coups, IMF structural adjustment, corporate extraction of natural resources, military interventions dressed up as humanitarian missions, sanctions that function as collective punishment. So when Venezuela resists, the world watches closely, because it signals that the old rules are optional now, that alternatives exist, that new alliances can protect countries that once stood alone. Now let's talk economics again, because beneath every military repositioning, there lies a deeper economic contradiction. U.S. capitalism is facing a long-term crisis: declining global dominance, competition from China, domestic inequality tearing the country apart, a working class struggling to survive, and a political system incapable of addressing the rot at its core. And instead of reinvesting in its own people, the U.S. invests in empire, because empire allows profits to flow upward to weapons manufacturers, fossil fuel giants, Wall Street banks. It's a wealth extraction mechanism disguised as foreign policy. But history teaches us something important. No empire can sustain external domination while neglecting internal decay. Rome couldn't. Britain couldn't. Spain couldn't. And the United States won't. This is why Venezuela matters, not because of the missiles, not because of Russia, but because Venezuela is a mirror reflecting the vulnerabilities of an empire stretched too thin. The U.S. cannot sanction half the planet, threaten the other half, and expect universal obedience. Those days are gone. What we are witnessing is not the rise of a villain or the fall of a hero. It is the natural rebalancing of a world long dominated by one power. And here's the final irony. If the United States embraced a multipolar world instead of resisting it, American workers would benefit. Less military spending, more investment at home, more diplomacy, less war, more cooperation, fewer sanctions, more shared prosperity, fewer crises. But for that to happen, Washington would need to break free from the elites who profit from imperial dominance. And those elites will resist until the very end. So as we look at Venezuela's new alliances, its missile deployments, its refusal to bow to U.S. pressure, remember this. This is not the story of a small country acting recklessly. This is the story of a global system evolving, shifting, adapting. And the U.S., for the first time in 30 years, must decide: cling to a fading empire or build a future based on cooperation rather than dominance. History is giving us a choice, but history will not wait forever.